Eleanor Pierce cut that cornbread with hands that shook. Not from the cold, from hunger. She had not eaten in 2 days, and she smiled anyway, setting the larger piece in front of Caleb and the other in front of Sammy, saying there was plenty more warming on the stove. There was nothing on that stove. There had been nothing for a long time. And somewhere in the dark beyond her frost-laced window, a man on horseback had seen every bit of it. If this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button right now and follow along until the very end. Because what happens next will stay with you. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that cold Wyoming night, and to a woman who gave everything she had to 2 little boys who didn't know she had nothing left. The winter of 1886 came down on Broken Creek, Wyoming, like something personal. It wasn't just cold. It was the kind of cold that settled into the walls of a house, into the floorboards, into the spaces between words, when a mother looked at her children and tried to smile. Eleanor Pierce had been doing that smiling for 7 months. Since the day they put Daniel in the ground, she had smiled at Caleb every morning, smiled at Sammy every night, smiled at the pastor when he said God had a plan, smiled at the women in town who brought casseroles the first 2 weeks, and then went back to their own lives and left her to figure out what God's plan looked like when the flour barrel was empty and the salt pork was long gone. That night, that particular Thursday night in January, she smiled at the cornbread. She had made it from the last of the meal, stretching it thin with a little water, pressing it into the cast iron pan she'd had since her wedding. It came out smaller than she'd hoped, flatter. She cut it straight down the middle with the old knife Daniel used to sharpen on Sunday mornings, and she set both halves on the table, and she told herself she wasn't hungry. "Mama, you ain't eaten," Caleb said. He was 10 years old and had his father's eyes dark and steady and too old for his face. He watched her the way Daniel used to, like he already knew the answer, but was asking anyway. "I ate earlier," Eleanor said, "while you boys were outside." "We weren't outside," Sammy said. He was 6, and he had not yet learned to let things go. "We were in here the whole time. I didn't see you eat nothing." "Anything," Eleanor corrected. She folded her hands in her lap under the table so they wouldn't see the trembling. "I didn't see you eat anything." Sammy blinked. "That's what I said." Caleb looked at his half of the cornbread. He looked at his mother. Then he broke his piece in 2 and pushed one half toward her side of the table. "Caleb, I'm not real hungry tonight," he said. He was lying. She knew it. He'd been out in the cold all afternoon trying to haul what was left of their wood supply, and his cheeks had that drawn-in look that came from a stomach that had been empty since morning. But he sat there with his jaw set and his shoulders straight already, the man of the house, in a way that made Eleanor's chest ache so badly she had to look away. "You eat every bite of that," she said, her voice coming out firm, the way she needed it to. "You hear me? Every single bite." "Yes, ma'am." She turned her attention to Sammy, making sure he was eating, asking about the bird he'd been watching out the window, the one that came and sat on the fence post every afternoon. She kept her hands under the table. She kept the smile in place. She was good at this. She had been practicing since April. What she didn't know, couldn't have known, was that there was a man outside. Nathan Crowley had not meant to stop. He'd been riding back from the far edge of his land, checking on the fence lines he'd had his ranch hands reinforce before the worst of the freeze set in. He had 4,000 acres out in the Broken Creek Valley, a solid herd, a cook named Dottie, who kept his kitchen running like a well-oiled piece of machinery, and not a single reason to slow his horse on the road that curved past the eastern fields. But his mare Duchess had gone a little lame in the right foreleg, and he'd slowed her down to a walk, and the slow walk had brought him alongside the small parcel of land where Daniel Pierce had built his family a house. He hadn't meant to look, but there was lamplight in the window, and he looked. He was not a sentimental man. He was 42 years old, and he had buried 2 hired men, a brother-in-law and his own wife, 14 years ago, and he had learned to move through grief the same way he moved through everything else, deliberately, without fuss, keeping his eyes on the work in front of him. He did not linger. He did not indulge. He had a reputation in Broken Creek for being hard but fair, and he had earned that reputation with years of early mornings and honest dealings. And he wore it like his coat, practical thick, not meant to impress anyone. But he stopped Duchess, and he looked through that window. He saw the table. He saw the two boys. He saw the woman with her hands folded in her lap, smiling at her youngest, like everything in the world was fine, and he saw because he was a man who paid attention to the things other people missed. The single plate on that table that was not in front of anyone. He saw the way she held herself. He saw the shake in her fingers when she reached over to brush the crumbs from Sammy's chin. He saw the way the older boy pushed his food toward her, and the way she pushed it right back, the whole small, quiet argument happening in gestures and glances in the language that families develop when they are trying to protect each other from the truth. He understood immediately what he was looking at. Nathan Crowley sat on his horse in the dark for a long moment, the cold working through his coat, the wind coming down off the ridge the way it did in January, mean and patient and thorough. He looked at that lamplight. He looked at that woman feeding her children with food she wasn't eating herself. And then he clicked his tongue at Duchess and rode home. He didn't say anything about it to Dottie. He came in, took off his coat, sat down at the table where a full supper was laid out. Roasted elk, boiled potatoes, bread that was still warm, apple preserves that Dottie had been putting up since October, and he sat there looking at it for a long time. Dottie refilled his coffee once and didn't ask. She had been cooking for him for 9 years, and she knew when to leave a man alone with his thinking. He ate about half of what was on his plate, pushed the rest around, went to bed before 8 and lay there looking at the dark ceiling while the wind pressed itself against the windows, and the house creaked around him the way old houses do in Wyoming winters. He was thinking about that little boy pushing his cornbread across the table. He was thinking about a woman with shaking hands and a steady smile. Before first light, he was in the kitchen. Dottie found him there when she came down at 5, and she stopped in the doorway and looked at him, standing at her work table pulling flour and cornmeal from the shelf, and she said, "Mr. Crowley, what in the Lord's name?" "I need a basket," he said. She stared at him. "A basket." Something with a handle, sturdy. Dottie was 61 years old and had raised 5 children of her own, and she knew the look on a man's face when he had decided something in the night, and there was no point in arguing. She got him the basket. She stood nearby while he worked, and after a minute, she started helping packing in the things he was setting out, adding a wedge of the good hard cheese she'd been aging, tucking in a small jar of molasses, because she had a feeling about where this was going, and she knew children needed sweetness. "The Pierce widow," she said. He didn't answer. "I heard she's been having a hard time of it," Dottie said. "People say, people talk too much," Nathan said. Dottie pressed her lips together. She added the molasses to the basket. He rode out before sunrise when the road was still gray, and the whole valley was held under that particular hush that comes just before the world starts up again. He set the basket on Eleanor Pierce's porch steps, tucking it close to the door so the wind wouldn't get to it, and then he rode back the way he'd come, without knocking, without leaving any note, without doing anything except what needed to be done. He told himself it was a one-time thing. Eleanor found the basket when she opened the door to bring in what little wood was left on the porch. She stood there in the cold in her house dress, with her shawl pulled around her shoulders, staring at it like it might be something that would disappear if she moved too fast. Then she crouched down and opened it, and the smell that came up, the good, solid smell of flour and salt pork and cheese, hit her somewhere behind the sternum, and for a second she couldn't breathe. She pressed her hand over her mouth. She looked out at the empty road. There was nobody. Just the snow and the gray morning sky and the sound of Sammy calling from inside the house asking if she wanted him to get the wood. "I've got it," she called back, and her voice was steady. She was good at that. She brought the basket inside and stood at the kitchen table looking at what was in it. And she thought about pride, and she thought about her boys, and then she started to cry quietly, with her back to the door, so neither of them would see. And then she stopped crying and started making breakfast. She told the boys she'd traded some of her sewing work for the supplies. Caleb looked at her the way he always did, long and careful, and she looked right back at him without blinking, and eventually he nodded and ate his eggs. The next morning, there was another basket, And the morning after that. She started watching earlier, getting up before dawn to look out the window, trying to catch whoever was doing this. She saw nothing. The road was always empty. The basket was always there. Whoever it was came in the dark and left the same way, and they never knocked, never announced themselves, never left so much as a boot print she could follow because the new snow always covered everything by morning. She asked around carefully, without giving away too much. She asked the woman at the dry goods store if anyone had been buying extra provisions. She asked old Gerald at the feed store if he'd noticed anything unusual. She kept her questions light-folded inside other conversations, the way women had learned to ask things in a town where asking directly was taken as weakness or worse, desperation. Nobody knew anything, or if they did, they weren't saying. The baskets kept coming. 3 weeks in there was something new tucked beside the food, a small carved wooden horse, smooth and precise, about 4 inches tall, the kind of work that took patience and skill. Sammy found it when he helped Eleanor unpack that morning's delivery, and he held it up with both hands, and his eyes went wide, and he said, "Mama, it's got a little saddle." It did. Someone had carved a tiny saddle into the horse's back, every detail exact, the kind of thing a man made when he was paying attention. "Can I keep it?" Sammy asked. "Of course you can," Eleanor said, and she turned away so he wouldn't see her face. The week after that, there was a bird. Carved from the same pale wood wings, spread slightly, beak tilted up. A small tag was tied around its neck with a piece of string, and on the tag in careful block letters were the words, "Hope." Caleb held it for a long time without saying anything. Then he set it on the windowsill where the light would catch it, and that was where it stayed. Eleanor had a name by the 4th week. It had taken her that long because she'd been approaching it the way she approached everything, methodically, without rushing, following what she knew. The baskets came from someone with resources. The food was good quality, not luxurious, but solid, and carefully selected, the kind of provisions that came from a well-stocked kitchen. The wooden toys were not purchased. They were made, and made well, by someone with a steady hand and a lot of time in the evenings. The whole operation had a quality of deliberateness to it that pointed toward a particular kind of person, not impulsive, not performing generosity for an audience, not the type who needed thanking. She thought about the ranchers in the area. She thought about who had the means and the disposition. And she came eventually to Nathan Crowley. She'd seen him in town a handful of times over the years, at the feed store, at the bank, once at the church social that Daniel had dragged her to the spring before he took sick. Crowley had stood near the door the whole time, drinking his coffee, and not talking to anyone in particular, leaving before the music started. Daniel had pointed him out. "That's Nathan Crowley. Runs the big spread out east." "Does he ever smile?" Eleanor had asked. "Not that I've seen," Daniel said. "But they say he's fair." She turned that over in her mind, now standing in her kitchen in the early dark, with a basket of provisions and a carved wooden bird on her windowsill. Fair. A man who was fair. A man who had looked at a widow and 2 hungry boys and decided, without asking permission, without expecting gratitude, without needing anyone to know, that something ought to be done. Caleb came downstairs in his socks and stopped when he saw her standing at the table. "Mama, you okay?" "Fine," she said. "I was just thinking." "About the baskets." She looked at him. He looked back at her with those steady Daniel eyes. "You know something," she said. He shifted his weight. "I might have seen someone. Couple weeks ago. I got up early because I heard I heard a horse. Went to the window. And, big man, dark coat, rode off before I could see much." He paused. He set the basket down real careful, Mama. Like he didn't want to make any noise. Like he didn't want to wake nobody up. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you had that look," Caleb said simply. "The one you get when you're about to say we don't need help." She opened her mouth, closed it again. Caleb sat down at this table and folded his hands like he was 40 years old. "We kind of do, though," he said. "Need help, don't we?" It wasn't really a question. Eleanor sat down across from him and looked at her son, this serious, careful boy who had been carrying more than he should for 7 months, and she said quietly, "Yes, we do." He nodded, like that settled something. She went back upstairs and she lay in the dark, and she thought about Nathan Crowley setting that basket down carefully so nobody would wake up. And in the morning, when Sammy was still asleep and Caleb was pulling on his boots, Eleanor Pierce stood at her front window and looked out at the long road that ran east toward the Crowley spread, and she made a decision of her own. She was going to find out who this man was. The real man. Not the reputation, not the stories, not the careful distance he maintained in town. She was going to find out what kind of person did what he was doing, and why, and what exactly she was supposed to do about it. Because Eleanor Pierce did not accept charity without understanding it. She never had, and she wasn't about to start now. She had told herself she was just going to look. That was the word she used in her own mind, writing it out like a justification. Just look, just ride past, just see the place from the road, and maybe catch a glimpse of the man who had been leaving those baskets, and then she would know, and knowing would be enough. She would go home, she would think it through. She would decide what the right thing was to do from a safe and reasonable distance. That was the plan. Eleanor Pierce had never been particularly good at plans. She left Caleb in charge of Sammy after breakfast, told them she had an errand in the East Valley, and pulled on her coat and her boots, and the good wool scarf Daniel had given her 2 winters ago. She did not tell them where she was going. Caleb watched her from the doorway with that look of his, and she said, "I'll be back before noon," and he said, "Yes, ma'am," and she walked out before he could ask anything else. The road east was hard-packed and gray under a sky that hadn't decided what it wanted to do yet. She walked because they had no horse anymore that had gone in October sold to the Hendersons down the road for enough to get them through November. She walked with her hands in her coat pockets and her breath coming out in small white clouds, and she told herself she was just looking. She saw the ranch before she heard it. The big split-rail fence, the long low barn set against the ridge. The main house solid and square with smoke coming from 2 chimneys. She slowed down. There were 2 ranch hands out by the fence line doing something with the wire, and a third leading a horse toward the barn, and the whole operation had the quiet efficiency of a place that was run well and run intentionally. Nothing wasted, nothing showy. She had almost talked herself into turning around when the barn door opened and Nathan Crowley walked out. She recognized him even at this distance. The height, the dark coat, the way he moved deliberate and unhurried like a man who had already thought through where he was going before he started. He had something in his hands, some piece of tack he was examining, and he was looking at it as he walked, and then he looked up and saw her standing on the road outside his fence, and he stopped. They looked at each other across that distance. Eleanor's first instinct was to wave just a polite wave, neighborly, nothing to explain, and keep walking. Her second instinct, which arrived about half a second later and was considerably stronger, was to stand her ground. She stood her ground. Nathan Crowley looked at her for a moment longer. Then he set the tack down on the fence rail and walked toward the gate. "Mrs. Pierce?" he said. His voice was exactly what she'd expected, low-measured with no particular inflection, the kind of voice that didn't waste itself on volume. "Mr. Crowley," she said. He stopped at the gate. He did not open it. He just stood there on his side and looked at her, and Eleanor had the sudden distinct impression that he was not surprised to see her. Not even a little. "You were expecting me," she said. It wasn't a question. He acknowledged it the same way, not quite a nod, just a slight shift of his weight, an adjustment of his jaw. "I figured it'd be sooner or later," he said. "Then you know why I'm here." "I've got a guess." Eleanor looked at him steadily. The wind moved between them, picking up a little off the ridge. "How long?" she said. He didn't pretend to misunderstand. "Since the 2nd week of January." She counted backward in her head. 5 weeks. He had been leaving those baskets for 5 weeks, and in that entire time had not once come to the door, not once left a note with his name on it, not once done anything that would have required her to acknowledge what he was doing. 5 weeks of provisions and wooden horses and carved birds named Hope, and not one single moment where she'd been put in the position of having to thank him for it or explain why she needed it. She understood then what he had been doing. Not just the giving, the way of the giving. "You did it so I wouldn't have to ask," she said. Something moved across his face, not quite an expression, more like the shadow of one. "Asking's a hard thing," he said, "especially for a woman with any kind of pride left." "Especially then," he agreed. Eleanor looked down at the fence rail between them. She looked back up at him. There was a speech she'd been composing in her head for the past 3 days. Something about accepting charity from strangers. Something about the importance of self-sufficiency. Something about the boys and what she needed them to learn about how the world worked. She had it all organized and ready. She had even practiced the tone firm, grateful, but not effusive, clear about her intentions going forward. She said none of it. What she said instead was, "My son is 10 years old, and he pushes his food at me at dinner because he thinks I'm not eating." Nathan Crowley was quiet. "He sits there," she said, "with his father's face and his father's eyes, and he lies to me about not being hungry. So I'll take his share, and I lie right back at him about already eating, and we sit at that table lying to each other every single night because neither one of us knows what else to do." She stopped. She hadn't meant to say that. She hadn't meant to say any of that. "Mrs. Pierce, I'm not finished." She pressed her hands together inside her coat pockets. "I came out here because I needed to know who you were, not who people say you are, who you actually are. Because I don't take things from people I don't understand, and I don't let my children take things from people I don't understand, and if this is some kind of—" She paused, chose the word carefully. "If there is some kind of expectation attached to those baskets that I haven't been told about, I need to know that right now before this goes any further." Nathan Crowley looked at her for a long moment. The 2 ranch hands by the fence had gone very quiet, though they were pretending not to have noticed anything. "There's no expectation," he said. "People don't give without expecting." "Some do." "Name one." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father used to say that a man who helps only when he'll get credit for it isn't helping. He's performing." Eleanor stared at him. "I saw your light," Nathan said. He said it simply, like it explained everything, and in a way it did. "I saw what was happening at your table. I went home and sat in front of a full supper and couldn't eat it, so I did something about it. That's the whole of it, Mrs. Pierce. There's no more to it than that." She believed him. That was the thing that unnerved her. She believed him immediately, in the way you believed people when they accidentally told you the truth without dressing it up first. He hadn't explained himself like a man making a case. He'd explained himself like a man stating a fact. "The boys found the toys," she said. "I know. I saw the bird in the window." She blinked. "You've been watching the house." "Not in any." He stopped. Started again. "I ride past on my morning check most days. The bird's been on the sill for 2 weeks. Caleb moves it to get the best light." A pause. "It's good to see." Eleanor didn't know what to do with that. She stood there with the cold working through her coat, and the wind coming off the ridge, and this man, this large, quiet, entirely unexpected man looking at her from the other side of his fence gate, like he was waiting for her to tell him how angry to be. She wasn't angry. That was the problem. She had come out here with the intention of being at least a little angry, because anger would have been simpler and cleaner and easier to carry home with her, and instead she was standing in the road feeling something considerably more complicated than anger. "I'm a good seamstress," she said. He waited. "I have accounts with 3 households in town already. I'm building toward more. I don't need—" She hesitated. "I don't need to be rescued, Mr. Crowley. That's not what this is, and it's not what I'll allow it to become." "No," he said. "I don't imagine it is. But my boys need to eat." "Yes. And I need—" She stopped. The word she was about to use was time, and she understood as soon as she thought it how much truth was packed inside it. She needed time. Time to build the sewing business to where it could support them, time to get through the worst of the winter time, to stop lying to Caleb at the dinner table. That was all she needed, just time. "I understand," Nathan said. "I haven't finished saying it." "I know, but I understand it anyway." She looked at him. He looked back at her. The wind moved between them again, and somewhere in the barn, a horse shifted and blew out a breath, and one of the ranch hands by the fence said something quietly to the other one. "I won't take anything I can't account for," Eleanor said. "I don't do debts I can't see the bottom of." "That's fair. If this continues," she said it carefully, weighing each word, "if this continues, then in spring when the ground thaws, I'll put in a kitchen garden. And I'll send things over. Vegetables, preserves, whatever comes up. You'll have an account with me the same as I have with you." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't need—" "I didn't ask what you need," she said. "I told you my terms." Something shifted in his expression then, just slightly, just at the corners, but Eleanor had been watching his face carefully enough to catch it. It was not quite a smile. It was something that had been in the same neighborhood as a smile once and still remembered the way there. "All right," Nathan Crowley said. "Your terms." She gave him a single nod. He gave her one back. And then, because she had said what she came to say, and she was not the kind of woman who lingered past the end of a conversation, Eleanor Pierce turned around and walked back up the road toward home. She made it about 40 yards before she heard him call after her. "Mrs. Pierce?" She stopped, turned. He was still standing at the gate, hands resting on the top rail, watching her. "There'll be flour tomorrow morning," he said, "and salt pork. Dottie put up extra." "I'll account for it," she said. "I know you will." She turned again, walked home, and she did not let herself think until she was well out of sight of the Crowley gate about the particular way he had said, "I know you will," like a man who had already decided something long before she had. Sammy was waiting for her on the porch when she got back, his wooden horse in one hand and a fistful of questions in the other, and she fielded them all with the steadiness she'd been practicing for 7 months. Caleb was in the kitchen, reheating what was left of breakfast, and he handed her a cup of coffee without being asked, and she took it and sat down and thought about terms and accounts and a man who helped without performing. It was Dottie who told her in bits and pieces over the next 2 weeks how things worked at the Crowley Ranch. Not because Dottie came to visit, she didn't nod at first, but because Broken Creek was a small town, and word moved through it the way water moved through winter-cracked ground, finding every opening, filling every space. Eleanor heard that Nathan Crowley had been up before dawn every day for 5 weeks. She heard that he'd been packing those baskets himself, not asking the hands to do it, not leaving it to Dottie, doing it himself at the kitchen table in the dark. She heard that when Bill Hartley at the feed store had mentioned casually that he heard the Pierce widow was struggling. Nathan Crowley had looked at him for a long, flat second, and then walked out of the store without buying anything. She heard it, and she filed it away the way she filed everything, quietly and without comment. The baskets kept coming. The provisions were solid and consistent. Nothing extravagant. Nothing that felt like pity wrapped in brown paper. Just good, honest food, in amounts that kept her household from going under. She kept her end of the accounting in a small notebook she'd found in Daniel's desk, writing down each delivery with the date and the approximate value, the way a woman who understood ledgers and did not intend to forget a single line of them would do. She was 3 pages into the notebook when the next thing happened. It was a Wednesday, which she knew because she did her sewing accounts on Wednesday mornings, and she was at the table with her numbers and her coffee when she heard Sammy make a sound on the porch. Not a scared sound, just surprised, and then a voice she didn't recognize said something in a low, friendly tone, and then Caleb's boots came quick across the floor, and she was already on her feet when the knock came at the door. She opened it. There was a woman on her porch, small, round-faced, with white hair and a wool coat that had seen 20 Wyoming winters and was ready to retire. She was holding a covered dish in both hands, and she was looking at Eleanor with the direct, assessing gaze of a woman who had decided something and was here to act on it. "Dottie Marsh," the woman said. "I cook for Nathan Crowley. You're Eleanor Pierce." "I am," Eleanor said. "Good. I brought you a potato soup." She held it out. It's still hot. I came in the wagon. Eleanor looked at the dish. She looked at Dottie. Mr. Crowley sent you. Lord, no. Dottie seemed mildly offended by the suggestion. He doesn't know I'm here. I came because I wanted to meet you myself. She tilted her head slightly. You going to let me in, or are we doing this in the cold? Eleanor stepped back from the door. Dottie came inside, set the soup on the table, looked around the kitchen with the quick, trained eye of a woman who spent her life in kitchens and said, You got any coffee? I do. Good. Sit down. I'll get it. Eleanor sat down. Dottie found the cups and the pot with no trouble and brought both to the table and sat across from Eleanor and looked at her with that direct gaze again, like she was reading something and wanted to make sure she had it right. He's a hard man to know, Dottie said. No preamble, no warm-up. I'd noticed, Eleanor said. That's not the same as a hard man to trust. There's a difference. I understand the difference. Dottie wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. He doesn't do things for show. Never has. His father was the same way, did what needed doing and didn't require an audience for it. Nathan saw your light in the window and something inside him went very quiet and very certain. And when that happens, he doesn't second-guess it. He just moves. She paused. You scared him a little showing up at the gate. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. I scared him. Not in a bad way. In the way that means something counted. Dottie looked at her steadily. He told me you set terms with him. I did. He came home and told me about it like he was reporting on something significant. Dottie's mouth curved slightly. He doesn't report on significant things. Usually he just goes quiet, and you can tell something mattered because of how much he doesn't say. But he told me about the terms. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. What exactly did he say? Dottie looked at her. He said you had more spine than anyone he'd met in 10 years and that you were going to be just fine. The kitchen was very still. He said that, Eleanor said. He did. Eleanor looked down at her coffee. She thought about Caleb pushing his cornbread across the table. She thought about Sammy with his wooden horse. She thought about a man who had stood at his fence gate in the cold and said, I know you will like it was simply a true thing and didn't need any decoration. Outside, the wind was picking up again. Another front coming in off the mountains, the kind that settled in for days. She could hear Sammy on the back porch talking to himself, the way he did narrating some private story about a wooden horse and a boy who rode it somewhere worth going. She looked at Dottie Marsh across the table. What does he need? Eleanor said. Actually need. Not the ranch, I mean. What does he actually need? Dottie was quiet for a moment. It was a different kind of quiet from Nathan Crowley's smaller, more considered the kind that came from a woman choosing how much to say. Company, Dottie said finally. The kind that doesn't require explaining yourself every 5 minutes. She picked up her coffee. He's been alone a long time, Mrs. Pierce, and not all of that loneliness was the widow kind. Eleanor absorbed that. She thought about it for the rest of the day, while she worked her needle through the seams of Mrs. Hartley's winter coat, while she listened to Caleb read aloud to Sammy after supper, while she sat at the window in the dark, after the boys were asleep, and watched the snow come down soft and steady on the fields. She thought about a man who moved without an audience, who packed baskets in the dark, who carved a bird, and named it Hope. She thought about her notebook with its 3 careful pages of accounts. She thought about what it would mean to keep adding to those pages, not out of debt, not out of pity, but out of something more deliberate than either. Something that looked, if she was being honest with herself, in the dark of a Wyoming winter night, a great deal like the beginning of understanding. The potato soup lasted 2 days, and when it was gone, Sammy asked if the Dottie lady was coming back, and Eleanor told him she didn't know, and Caleb looked up from his book and said, I liked her. Like that settled the matter entirely. It didn't settle anything. But Eleanor wrote it down in the back of her mind, the way she wrote everything important carefully in permanent ink. The accounts notebook was on its 5th page now. She kept it in the drawer beneath the sewing table tucked under a length of blue calico she'd been saving, and she opened it every few days to add the new entries with the date and the value and a brief description. flour 3 pounds, salt pork wrapped in cloth, eggs 1 dozen, cornmeal, dried beans, a small tin of coffee that she had not expected and that made her stand at the kitchen table for a full minute before she could put it away. She was going to account for every last bit of it. She was going to account for it and settle it, and look Nathan Crowley in the eye when she did, and until that day, the notebook was her way of keeping herself honest. It was the coffee that made her decide she needed to do something in return. Not eventually. Now. She had 3 sewing accounts in town. Mrs. Hartley's winter alterations, 2 shirts for Gerald Marsh's oldest boy, and a dress commission from the school teacher that was due by the end of February. She was also taking in mending from 2 other households, the kind of work that paid small but paid steady. And she had been careful with every cent, keeping a separate column in the notebook for income versus the Crowley account, watching the gap narrow slowly, the way a woman watches a wound heal, checking it daily, without quite letting herself believe it yet. The coffee changed her math slightly. Not the money, the coffee was not expensive. It was the gesture. It was the specific knowledge that someone had thought she drinks coffee and had acted on that thought in the dark before sunrise without being asked. That was not provision. That was attention. And Eleanor Pierce, who had not been the subject of anyone's deliberate attention since Daniel died, found that it unsettled her in ways she was not prepared for and needed to address practically before they got out of hand. So, she baked. She used some of the flour from the last basket, and she made 2 loaves of good bread. Real bread. Not the flat, thin cornbread of the lean weeks, but proper risen bread with a dark crust, and she wrapped them in the cleanest cloth she had, and she told Caleb she was going to the Crowley ranch. Caleb put down his book. "You want me to come?" "No." "You sure?" "Caleb." He picked up his book. She walked the road east again. Same road, same cold, different morning. The sky was doing something complicated with the light, that particular February quality where the sun was technically present but hadn't committed to anything. She walked fast because she was cold, and because walking fast kept her from thinking too much, and she was at the Crowley gate in 20 minutes, and this time she did not stop at the road. She went to the gate and opened it herself and walked up to the main house and knocked. Dottie answered. She looked at Eleanor. She looked at the bread. She stepped back from the door without saying anything, which was its own kind of welcome. "Is he here?" Eleanor said. "Barn," Dottie said. "Where else?" Eleanor set the bread on the kitchen table. She took a breath. She went back outside and walked to the barn and pulled the door open, and the smell hit her. First hay and horse and leather, and the particular warmth of a working space. And then her eyes adjusted, and she saw Nathan Crowley at the far end, crouched beside a mare's left foreleg, running his hand down the bone with the focused attention of a man who was listening with his fingers. He heard the door. He looked up. "Mrs. Pierce?" He said it the same way he always did, not surprised but aware, like he registered her presence the way he registered weather, seriously and with full attention. "I brought bread," she said. "I left it with Dottie." She paused. "I wanted to tell you in person that I brought it, so you'd know it was intentional and not just Dottie being Dottie." The corner of his mouth moved. "There's a distinction." "There is." She came further into the barn and stopped a reasonable distance away and looked at the mare. "What's wrong with her leg?" "Heat in the fetlock. Been watching it 3 days." He pressed his thumb gently against a specific point, and the mare shifted and blew out. "She'll be fine. Just needs rest and attention." "Do you do all your own veterinary work?" "Most of it. Doc Purcell's 2 hours out in good weather." He stood up, dusted his knees, looked at Eleanor. "You walked again. It's not far. It's 2 miles. I'm aware of how far it is." He looked at her for a moment with that steady, dark gaze of his. "Coffee's on," he said. "If you want." She hadn't planned to stay. She'd planned to drop the bread with Dottie, say what she'd come to say, and go back home to her sewing. That was the plan. She'd been very clear with herself about the plan. "All right," she said. They went inside. Dottie had already sliced one of the loaves and put it on a board on the table, and she poured 2 cups of coffee and then announced she had things to see to in the back of the house, which Eleanor understood was Dottie removing herself with all the subtlety of a woman who thought subtlety was overrated. Nathan sat across from her at the kitchen table. It was a big table, scarred and solid, the kind of table that had hosted a lot of meals and a lot of decisions. Eleanor wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and looked at the bread on the board. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Go ahead." "Hartley. Bill Hartley at the feed store." She kept her eyes on her cup. "I heard you walked out when he mentioned my situation. Is that true?" A beat. "Yes." "Why?" Nathan was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that was not evasive, just considered. "Because what you were dealing with wasn't his to discuss," he said, "and because he was doing it with the kind of face men put on when they think struggling is a character flaw." Eleanor looked up at that. "You know that face," he said. It was not a question. "I know it very well," she said. "I don't have patience for it." She studied him. "People in this town think you're hard," she said. "Cold, some of them say." "I know what they say. Are they wrong?" He thought about that for a moment. Actually thought about it, which surprised her. Most men either defended themselves immediately or dismissed the question. He did neither. "I don't warm up fast," he said finally. "And I don't see the point of pretending things are fine when they're not. That reads as cold to people who'd rather be comfortable than honest." He picked up his coffee. "I'm not cruel. There's a difference." "I know the difference," Eleanor said. They drank their coffee. Outside, one of the ranch hands was doing something near the fence that involved some hammering, and the mare in the barn made an occasional comment about it, and Dottie moved around in the back of the house, and the fire in the kitchen stove popped and settled. "My husband was warm," Eleanor said. She hadn't planned to say it, but she was in the habit increasingly of saying true things in this kitchen. "He talked to everyone, remembered names, remembered children's birthdays, could walk into any room and make people feel easier inside 10 minutes. She paused. "I used to think that was the most important quality a person could have." Nathan waited. "I still think it's valuable," she said, "but I've been reconsidering my list." She looked at him directly. "The quality I've been thinking about most these past 2 months is reliability. Quiet, consistent reliability. No announcement, no performance. Just present, just done." He held her gaze. "Eleanor." It was the first time he'd used her name. Just her given name, without the Mrs., without the Pierce. It landed between them like something that had been set down carefully and was now just sitting there, waiting to see what happened next. She didn't look away. "I'm not saying anything beyond what I said," she said steadily. "I'm accounting for what I've observed, that's all." "All right," he said, "but I'm also not pretending I haven't observed it." "I wouldn't ask you to." Another silence. Different from the ones before it. Warmer somehow, and more honest, and slightly dangerous in the way that honest warmth always was. Then Caleb walked in. Not walked, arrived. The barn door swung open at the side of the house, and Caleb came through the kitchen door in his coat, and his boots cheeks red from the walk, Sammy 3 steps behind him, with the wooden horse in his coat pocket because he took it everywhere. They both stopped when they saw Nathan Crowley at the table. Sammy stared. Caleb looked at his mother with a completely neutral expression that communicated everything. "I told you to stay home," Eleanor said. "You did," Caleb agreed. "Sammy wanted to see the horses." "I did." Sammy confirmed immediately. He was looking at Nathan with the uncomplicated directness of a 6-year-old. "Are you the man who made my horse?" Nathan looked at the boy. Something in his face shifted, just slightly, just enough. "I am," he said. Sammy pulled the wooden horse from his pocket and held it out. "It's the best one I ever had. The saddle is real little. Can you make a rider to go on it?" "Sammy," Eleanor said. "I can do that," Nathan said. Sammy's face split into something enormous. "Can I see the horses? The real ones?" Nathan looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at Nathan. A whole conversation happened in about 3 seconds that neither of them could have articulated, but both understood perfectly. "Come on then," Nathan said. He stood up from the table. He was very tall, and Sammy craned his neck back to look up at him with the pure, fearless curiosity of a child who had not yet learned to be cautious about size. They went out to the barn, Nathan, Sammy, and Caleb, who was pretending to be indifferent and failing completely. Eleanor stayed at the kitchen table with her coffee and listened to Sammy's voice rise through the wall, asking rapid-fire questions she could not quite make out, and Nathan's low voice answering each one, and Caleb saying something that made Nathan give a short, surprised sound that might, if she was generous with her interpretation, have been a laugh. She looked down at her coffee cup. She looked at the bread on the board. She was very carefully not thinking about what she was feeling. Dottie appeared from the back of the house, refilled Eleanor's cup without asking, sat down in the chair Nathan had been sitting in, and said, "He laughed. I heard something. That was a laugh." Dottie's voice was very dry. "I know, because I've heard it approximately 4 times in 9 years, and I've gotten good at identifying it." Eleanor wrapped her hands around the fresh coffee. "Dottie, I'm just noting what I observed," Dottie said in a tone that was almost exactly the tone Eleanor had used 10 minutes earlier, just with considerably more satisfaction in it. Eleanor pressed her lips together. She was not going to smile. She was absolutely not going to smile. She smiled. Dottie looked at the table and said nothing, which was the kindest thing she could have done. They stayed 2 hours. Sammy learned the name of every horse in the barn and announced that he was going to be a rancher. When he grew up, a decision he appeared to reach with complete finality. Caleb and Nathan had some kind of conversation about fence construction that Eleanor was not party to, but that resulted in Caleb asking careful questions, and Nathan answering them with the same seriousness he brought to everything, treating the 10-year-old like a man who deserved real answers. On the way home, walking the 2 miles back in the cold, Sammy chattered continuously. Caleb walked beside Eleanor in his father's silence, and she knew he was thinking, and she let him think because he'd earned it. About a mile from home, he said, "He's different than I thought." "What did you think?" Caleb considered. "Scary, in the regular way. But he's not scary like that. He's more like—" He paused, searching. "Like when you know something's solid. Like the fence posts he was talking about. You put them in right, and they don't move. That kind of." Eleanor looked at her son walking beside her in the cold. "That's a good way to put it," she said. Caleb nodded. "I like him," he said. "Simple. Final. His father's way of deciding things." Eleanor looked at the road ahead of them and thought about fence posts set in right and not moving, and about a man who laughed 4 times in 9 years, and about the way her name had sounded in his mouth when he'd forgotten to put the formality around it. She thought about all of it carefully, the way she kept her accounts. And that evening, when the boys were asleep and the fire was low and the notebook was open on the sewing table, she picked up her pen and she did not write down flour or salt pork or dried beans. She wrote February 14th, 2 hours in a warm kitchen. Something that cannot be accounted for in the usual way. Then she closed the notebook and sat with that in the dark for a long time. That was the night the town decided to get involved. She didn't know it yet. She was sitting at her sewing table thinking about fence posts and the sound of her name, and she didn't know that 3 doors down from the feed store, in the parlor of the woman who organized most of what passed for social opinion in Broken Creek, a conversation was happening that had Eleanor Pierce and Nathan Crowley's names in it. She didn't know that the word charity was being used in the tone people used when they meant something worse. She didn't know that Bill Hartley had gone home from that feed store encounter and mentioned it to his wife, and his wife had mentioned it to her sister, and the sister had mentioned it to the woman in the parlor, and the woman in the parlor had been building a case ever since. She didn't know any of it. She knew only that her notebook had an entry she couldn't quantify, and that her son had said the word solid in the same voice he used for things that mattered, and that somewhere 2 miles east, a man she was only beginning to understand was probably in his barn right now, checking on a mare with a warm fetlock in the dark, moving quietly so as not to startle her. She thought that was about the most Nathan Crowley thing she could imagine, and she did not examine too carefully why that thought made her feel for the first time in 7 months, like something in her chest had loosened just slightly, like a knot that wasn't ready to come undone, but had finally admitted It was tired of being so tight. She blew out the lamp. She went to bed. And the town of Broken Creek, which had opinions about everything and the patience to act on them slowly, was already sharpening its tongue for what came next. The woman in the parlor was named Vera Hutchins, and she had lived in Broken Creek for 23 years, and considered that tenure a form of ownership. She owned the opinion of the town the way some people owned land, quietly through consistent occupation, through being present in every room where decisions got made, through the particular skill of saying things in a tone that made other people feel they had thought of it themselves. She had not liked Eleanor Pierce from the beginning. Not because Eleanor had done anything wrong. Because Eleanor had done nothing that required Vera's approval, and women like Vera Hutchins ran on approval, the way a mill ran on water. It was not optional. It was the mechanism itself. Eleanor found out on a Thursday morning. She was at the dry goods counter, picking up thread she'd placed an order 2 weeks back. Good quality black thread for the Hartley Commission, and she was waiting for Gerald's wife to find it in the back when she heard her name. Not said to her. Said about her in the particular murmured register that women used when they wanted to be overheard without being accountable for it. Can't blame her for taking what she can get, I suppose. But the way she's been going out there, the children too, now it doesn't look right. Daniel Pierce, not cold in his grave, 6 months, and she's 7 months, another voice said. 7 then. And Nathan Crowley of all people. He's got no business. Eleanor set her coin on the counter and walked to the back of the store. She didn't do it fast, which was the important thing. She walked at exactly the pace of a woman who had somewhere to be and was getting there without rushing. And she stopped in the doorway, where the 2 women, Martha Eldon and a younger woman she didn't know well, someone's cousin visiting from Cheyenne, were standing with their fabric selections and their careful voices. Martha, Eleanor said. Martha Eldon went red from the collar up. I didn't, she started. I know what you said, Eleanor said. Her voice was completely level. I want you to know that I heard it, and I want you to think about whether it's true before you say it again to someone else. She looked at Martha directly. Nathan Crowley has been a neighbor in need. That is the entirety of it. And if the town of Broken Creek has nothing better to discuss than a widow keeping her children fed through winter, then this town has considerably more time on its hands than I realized. She turned around and went back to the counter and picked up her thread when Gerald's wife brought it out and said thank you and left. She walked home fast. Not because she was upset. She was upset, but that wasn't why she was walking fast. She was walking fast because she needed to think, and she thought better when she was moving, and what she was thinking about was not Martha Eldon. She was thinking about Nathan, because whatever was being said in the dry goods store was also being said everywhere else, which meant it was going to reach him if it hadn't already. And she needed to know, with the kind of clarity she applied to her accounts, whether his continued help was going to cost him something in this town. Whether her accepting it was doing him damage he hadn't agreed to absorb. She was at her sewing table when Dottie came by that afternoon. Not a planned visit. Dottie didn't plan visits. She just appeared when something needed addressing, which Eleanor had come to understand was its own kind of care. You heard, Dottie said, sitting down without being invited. I heard. He knows, Dottie said. He heard it this morning at the feed store. Someone thought they'd let him know what people were saying in that way people do when they want to cause trouble and call it concern. Eleanor looked up from her sewing. What did he do? What he always does, went quiet, finished his business, came home. Dottie folded her hands on her knee. He's not going to stop, Eleanor. I want you to know that before you decide anything. Whatever you're planning to say to him, that part won't change. I'm not planning to ask him to stop. Dottie looked at her. I'm planning to ask him to let me handle it, Eleanor said. She went to the Crowley ranch the next morning. She'd thought through what she wanted to say, and she said it plainly at the kitchen table over coffee she'd stopped pretending she didn't want. People are talking, she said. I know, Nathan said. It'll affect you more than me. Your business dealings, your sorrow. No, he said. She stopped. No what? No, it won't affect my business dealings. He looked at her steadily. Bill Hartley needs my grain contracts more than he needs Vera Hutchins' good opinion. Same for most of the men who do business with this ranch. The ones who'd pull back over gossip weren't reliable partners to begin with. Nathan. Eleanor. He said her name the same way he had that first time, careful and direct, without the formality wrapped around it. I've been managing my reputation in this town for 15 years. I know which parts of it matter and which parts don't. This doesn't. She looked at him. It matters to me, she said. What it looks like. What people think about why you've been. What do you think? He said. Not what they think. What do you think about why I've been doing this? The question landed in the middle of the kitchen and sat there. Eleanor kept her eyes on her coffee cup. She was quiet for long enough that the kitchen settled around them. The fire, the mare outside, the distant sound of a ranch hand calling to another across the yard. I think, she said carefully, that you saw something that night and it didn't sit right with you. And I think you're not the kind of man who lets things sit wrong when he can do something about them. She paused. And I think it started that way, and then became something else gradually, without either of us planning for it to. Nathan was very still, and I think, Eleanor said, that I don't know what to do with that, because I'm still accounting for everything else, and I haven't figured out how to account for that part. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the fullest silence Eleanor had experienced in 7 months, which was saying something because she had experienced a great deal of silence since April. You don't have to account for everything, Nathan said finally. I do, she said. It's who I am. I know. A beat. I'm not asking you to be different. I'm saying some things don't run on ledgers. She looked up at him. He met her eyes and held them and did not look away. And Eleanor Pierce, who had been managing everything alone for 7 months, with a smile plastered in place and her hands folded under the table so no one could see them. Shaking, felt something crack open in her chest that she could not immediately identify and could not immediately close. Don't, she said quietly. Don't what? Don't be kind to me right now. I can't. She stopped, pressed her lips together. I'm fine. I'm handling everything. I just need to finish handling it without Eleanor. I'm fine. I know you're fine, he said. You've been fine every single day for 7 months, and I watched you be fine when you were cutting that cornbread, and I watched you be fine when you said it in front of your boys and took nothing for yourself, and I am telling you right now that being fine when you're not is the loneliest thing I know, and you don't have to do it at this table. The kitchen was very quiet. Eleanor looked at this table. She breathed slowly the way she'd learned to breathe when she needed to stay level. In, out, steady. Daniel used to say I was the most capable woman he'd ever met, she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. He meant it as a compliment. I think toward the end he relied on it more than he realized. I got so used to managing everything that I forgot to tell him when I couldn't. She paused. And then he was gone, and there was no one to tell anyway. Nathan said nothing. He just stayed there across the table, present and solid, which was the right thing, and she suspected he knew it. I'm not, she said. I don't want. She stopped. Started again. I have 2 boys who are watching everything I do. Every decision I make is going to teach them something about how the world works, and what a woman is worth, and whether you ask for help when you need it, or whether you cut your own food in half and smile about it. I'm very aware of that. What do you want to teach them? Nathan said. She looked at him. That you accept honest help from honest people, she said. And that you don't let pride starve your children. Then let me help, he said. Not because you can't manage, because you don't have to manage alone. Something about that, the specific arrangement of those words, the distinction he'd drawn between capability and isolation, hit Eleanor somewhere she hadn't expected. She looked at the coffee cup in her hands and thought about Caleb pushing his cornbread across the table, and about an entry in a notebook that said something that cannot be accounted for in the usual way, and about the word solid. All right, she said. Nathan nodded. That was all. Just the nod, and then he picked up his coffee and the kitchen settled back into its regular sounds, and Dottie came in from outside with her coat still on and looked at both of them and said, "There's a situation," which was not the transition either of them had expected. "What kind of situation?" Nathan said. "Vera Hutchins' kind." Dottie pulled off her coat and hung it by the door. "She went to Pastor Klein this morning. Told him she had concerns about the moral example being set for the Pierce children by the widow's friendship with an unmarried man. She said it flatly, the way you said things that were absurd, but had consequences. The pastor's planning to visit Eleanor this afternoon." Eleanor set down her coffee cup. "She went to the pastor," Eleanor said. "She did. Over baskets of flour and one afternoon in a barn." "Vera Hutchins doesn't need much to work with," Dottie said. "Just enough to feel righteous." Eleanor stood up. The decision was already made before she was fully on her feet. She felt it happen that fast, the same way she'd felt it happen when she'd decided to walk to the gate, when she'd decided to bake the bread, when she'd decided that she was not going to let her children watch her shrink. "I'm going to talk to her," Eleanor said. "Eleanor," Nathan started. "Not you, me." She looked at him. "This is mine to handle. You said I don't have to manage alone. That's true. But there are things a woman has to walk into herself or they don't stick." She picked up her coat from the chair back. "Vera Hutchins has been running the opinion of this town on borrowed authority for 20 years. The only reason it works is because people let it. People don't push back because they need her goodwill for something." She buttoned her coat. "I don't need her goodwill for anything." Dottie looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at Eleanor. He picked up his hat from the table and held it out to her, not for her to wear, just as a gesture, the kind of gesture that meant, "I see you, and I'm not going to stop you." She looked at the hat. She looked at him. She left. Vera Hutchins's house was on the good side of town, which in Broken Creek meant it had 2 stories and curtains in the windows. Eleanor knocked on the front door at 11 in the morning and stood there in the cold with her hands at her sides and her back straight. Vera opened the door. She looked at Eleanor with the expression of a woman who had been expecting this and had arranged her face accordingly, composed, faintly concerned, draped in the authority of someone who believed her concern was the same thing as righteousness. "Mrs. Pierce," she said, "I wasn't expecting—" "Yes, you were," Eleanor said. "May I come in?" Vera stepped back. Eleanor came in. She stood in the front parlor and she looked around it. The good furniture, the embroidered cushions, the particular airlessness of a room that was maintained as a performance, and then she looked at Vera Hutchins and she said, "I understand you spoke to Pastor Klein." "I expressed some concerns, yes, about the children. My children are fed and warm and sleeping through the night for the first time since October," Eleanor said. "If you'd like to express concern about something, start there. Start with the 4 months before anyone in this town thought to leave anything on my porch." Vera opened her mouth. "I'm not finished." Eleanor kept her voice even. Not cold, not sharp, even, which was harder and more effective than either. "Nathan Crowley is a man of good character who acted out of genuine decency at a time when this town was looking the other direction. What he's done for my family is honest and without condition, and I have accounted for every bit of it, and when spring comes, I will be settling that account in full." She paused. "If you have taken that and built something improper out of it, that says considerably more about the architecture of your imagination than it does about either of us." The parlor was very still. Vera Hutchins was not a woman who was spoken to this way. Eleanor could see that in the color rising in her face and the particular quality of her silence, not the silence of someone thinking, but of someone recalibrating. "The pastor will still visit," Vera said finally. Her voice had thinned slightly. "It's his duty to—" "Pastor Klein is a good man," Eleanor said. "I'll welcome him. We'll have coffee and he can see for himself what my household looks like and draw his own conclusions." She buttoned the top button of her coat, which she had not unbuttoned. "And when he's done drawing them, I suspect they will not match yours." She left. She walked down Vera's front steps and back out onto the main road, and she did not hurry, and she did not look back, because looking back would have implied she was uncertain about something, and she was not uncertain about anything. Pastor Klein did visit that afternoon. He sat at Eleanor's table and drank his coffee and looked at the clean kitchen and the two boys doing their schoolwork at the table, Caleb helping Sammy with his letters, the carved wooden bird on the windowsill catching what winter light there was, and he said in his mild way that he was glad to find her household in good order. "It's been in good order," Eleanor said, "since April." He nodded. He drank his coffee. He left, and she had the distinct impression that whatever Vera Hutchins had told him, and whatever he'd expected to find, were two different things, and the difference had not gone unnoticed. That evening, Nathan's ranch hand rode out with the next basket. Inside, under the flour, was a small piece of paper folded twice. Eleanor unfolded it at the kitchen table while Caleb was heating water, and Sammy was asleep, already worn out from a day of letters. On the paper in Nathan Crowley's careful block handwriting were 4 words. How did it go? She looked at it for a long moment. Then she found a pencil and wrote under his words. She blinked first, and she put the paper in the basket for the hand to carry back. 2 minutes later, or what felt like 2 minutes, though it was probably closer to 20, since the ranch hand had to ride both ways, Caleb came to the table with a small folded paper and said, "The hand came back. Said Mr. Crowley wanted me to give you this." Eleanor unfolded it. 1 word. Good. She set the paper down. She pressed her lips together firmly. She looked out the dark window at the road east, at the nothing she could see in the dark, at the distance between her table and his kitchen, and the particular quality of a man who had waited by his door for a ranch hand to ride back, just to know she was all right. Caleb was watching her with those eyes. "Mama," he said. "Go to bed," she said. "Are you?" "I'm fine," she said. And then she caught herself remembering Nathan's voice saying, "Being fine when you're not is the loneliest thing I know." She looked at her son. "Actually," she said, "I'm better than fine. I think things are going to be all right, Caleb." He studied her. Then something in his face settled some long tension she hadn't fully realized. He was carrying some weight he'd been holding since April, and he said, "Okay," and went to bed. Eleanor sat at the table alone with the word "good" written on a small piece of paper and the accounts notebook open to its 6th page. She picked up her pen. She thought for a moment. Then she wrote, February 19th. She blinked first. And below that, in smaller letters, "I think we're going to be fine." Spring came to Broken Creek the way it always did, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm day, then 3 cold ones. The snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes and holding firm everywhere else. The ground going from iron to mud in the span of an afternoon, then freezing solid again overnight, like the earth couldn't quite commit to what it wanted to be. Eleanor knew exactly how it felt. She'd turned the last page of the accounts notebook in the 3rd week of February and started a second one. The sewing business had grown word moved through a small town in both directions, and whatever Vera Hutchins had intended by going to Pastor Klein, what had actually happened was that several women who privately found Vera exhausting had made a point of bringing their mending and their commissions to Eleanor Pierce. Whether out of sympathy or defiance or genuine need, Eleanor didn't ask. She took the work, and she did it well, and she charged fairly, and she said thank you without elaborating. By March, she had 7 regular accounts. By the 1st week of April, she had 11. She told Nathan the number on a Tuesday, sitting at his kitchen table, which had become a thing they did not every day, not on any fixed schedule, just when there was something worth saying, and the road between them felt less like a distance and more like a habit. He listened to her say 11 accounts with the same attention he gave everything, and then he said, "What do you need to grow it further?" She'd thought about that already. "A proper table. The one I have is too small for cutting larger pieces. And a second lamp, the light in the evenings, isn't enough for fine work." He nodded. He didn't say I'll get it or leave it to me. He said, "What kind of table?" And that was how they spent the next 40 minutes, her describing what she needed, him asking specific questions about dimensions and height and wood type. Both of them treating it like the practical problem it was, which was also the most intimate conversation Eleanor had had in a year, because it assumed a future and neither of them acknowledged that directly. The table arrived 4 days later in Nathan's wagon, built by the ranch hand who turned out to have been a furniture maker in Ohio before he came west. It fit exactly into the space beside the window. Eleanor ran her hand along the surface and did not say anything for a moment, and then said, "Tell me what I owe you." "Time," Nathan said. He was standing in the doorway of her house, hat in hand. "I'll let you know when I figure out what kind." She looked at him. He looked back at her with that steady dark gaze that she had long since stopped trying to read quickly, because it rewarded patience and punished rushing the same way he did. "That's not a number," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not." She let it stand. She added an entry to the second notebook, April 4th. "One work table well made, payment terms pending." The kitchen garden went in the second week of April, when the ground finally stayed soft long enough to work. Eleanor and Caleb turned the soil on the south side of the house while Sammy supervised with his wooden horse and offered opinions on where things should go. Nathan came by on the Saturday not to do the work she hadn't asked him to, but he stood at the fence and watched for a while, and then said, "Your row spacing is tight on the left side. The squash'll crowd." "Come fix it then," Caleb said without looking up from his digging. Eleanor looked at her son. He was 11 now. His birthday had been in March, a quiet thing, just the three of them, and a cake Dottie had sent over, and he had developed in the past 3 months a new quality she was still adjusting to. He was not rude. He was direct. There was a difference, and it was the same difference Nathan had described between cold and cruel, and she understood that Caleb had learned it by watching. Nathan came through the fence gate and fixed the row spacing. He stayed 2 hours. When he left, Caleb watched him ride out and said, "He knows a lot about gardens for a cattle rancher." "People know more than one thing," Eleanor said. "I know," Caleb said. He picked up his shovel. "I like that about him." The twist came on a Thursday in late April, and Eleanor did not see it coming, which was unusual because she generally saw things coming. She had been watching for Vera Hutchins to make another move, something through the church, something through the bank, where her husband had influence, something. But what arrived was not from Vera. It was from a lawyer. His name was Peter Aldous, and he rode up to her door on a gray horse with a leather satchel and the manner of a man delivering something he found personally distasteful. He handed her a document. She read it on her porch with him standing there, and her face did not change because she had learned a long time ago that your face was the first thing people took from you if you let them. The document was a claim against Daniel's land. There was a debt, or what was presented as a debt, that Daniel had apparently signed for in the fall before he died, a loan from a man named Carver who operated out of Cheyenne. Eleanor had never heard of Carver. She had gone through Daniel's papers after he died with the thoroughness of a woman who needed to understand exactly what she had and what she owed, and there had been no mention of any Carver, no loan document, nothing. And yet, here was a lawyer on her porch with a claim on the land her boys slept on. "How much?" she said. Aldous told her. She stood there with the document in her hands and the number in her head, and she thought very specifically about what it would mean. The land gone, the house gone. The boys relocated the sewing business that she'd built account by account. Over 4 months dissolved because the table she cut fabric on would no longer have a floor beneath it. "I'll need 2 weeks," she said. Her voice was even. "Mrs. Pierce, the terms state 2 weeks," she said again, "to review the document and consult with my own counsel." Aldous looked at her with the mild surprise of a man who had expected this to go faster. "Of course," he said, and rode off. Eleanor went inside. She sat at her new work table. She read the document 3 more times slowly, and the 3rd time through, she found it a small thing. The kind of thing a person who didn't read documents carefully would miss. The date on the supposed loan was September 14th, 1885. Daniel had been bedridden from the 15th of September with the lung sickness that eventually killed him. She had nursed him herself for 6 weeks before he died. He had not signed anything in September. He had barely been able to hold a cup. She closed the document. She sat very still for a moment. Then she stood up and told Caleb she was going to the Crowley Ranch. Nathan read the document at his kitchen table. He read it the same way Eleanor did, slowly, carefully, without commentary, until he'd finished. When he set it down, his face had that quality she'd come to recognize, the one that looked like stillness, but was actually a very controlled version of something considerably less still. "The date," he said. "September 14th, she said. "He was sick by the 15th. "He was sick by the 15th. Nathan looked at the document. He looked at her. "You have proof of that?" "I have the doctor's records." Doc Purcell came out on the 17th and started the visits. "I have his invoices with dates. I have the neighbors who saw me carrying water to the bedroom. I have—" She stopped. "I have enough." "Then this goes nowhere," Nathan said. "It still has to be fought," Eleanor said, "which costs time and costs money, and is designed to exhaust a woman who is already carrying everything she can carry." She looked at him steadily. "I know what this is, Nathan. Someone decided that the lawyer route would accomplish what the gossip route didn't. I just need to know if I'm right about who." He was quiet for a moment. "Carver out of Cheyenne," he said. "I know that name. He buys distressed land claims. He needs a local contact who can identify the targets. And tell him which widow is vulnerable, and which widow has no lawyer, and no advocate, and no one in her corner." Nathan looked at her. The name neither of them had said sat in the kitchen between them like a stone on the table. "I'll ride to Cheyenne," Nathan said. "You will not," Eleanor said. "Eleanor, you will not ride to Cheyenne to fight my fight." She said it without heat, just the plain line of it. "That is not how this works between us. You know that." She held his gaze. "What I need from you is the name of a good lawyer in this county, and a character reference if it comes to that. That's what I need. Can you give me that?" He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him absorbing it, the boundary, the logic of it, the specific kind of trust it took to let someone handle their own war. "James Whitfield," he said finally. "In Laramie. He's the best in the territory, and he owes me a professional courtesy." "Then write me a letter of introduction," she said. "I'll do the rest." He wrote it at the table, right there in his careful block handwriting. She watched him write it, and she thought about a man who could have ridden to Cheyenne and made this disappear with his name and his resources and his 4,000 acres of authority, and had instead picked up a pen and written her a letter of introduction so she could make it disappear herself. She thought that might be the most significant thing he had ever done. James Whitfield was a small, precise man with a quick mind and the ability to read a legal document the way Eleanor read a seam, finding every place where something had been forced that wasn't meant to go that way. He read the Carver claim in his Laramie office with Eleanor sitting across from him, and he set it down after 8 minutes and said, "This is fraudulent." "I know," Eleanor said. "Can you prove it?" "In about 3 days' work," he said. "Dr. Purcell's records, 2 affidavits from neighbors, and a letter to the Cheyenne County Clerk's office." He looked at her over his glasses. "Nathan Crowley speaks very highly of you." "He's a fair man," Eleanor said. "He wrote that you were the most capable person he'd dealt with in 10 years, Whitfield said. "In a letter of introduction, that's the equivalent of most people building a cathedral in your honor." Eleanor looked at the document on his desk. She thought about the word capable, how Daniel had used it as a compliment, how she'd grown to carry it as a weight, how it had felt different when Nathan said it like he meant it as a fact about her, without it being the only fact. "How much do I owe you?" she said. Whitfield named a number. She had it barely in the careful savings of 4 months of accounts, and she paid it without flinching, and shook his hand, and rode the borrowed horse back to Broken Creek. 3 weeks later, the claim was dismissed. Peter Aldous did not come back. Carver sent no further correspondence, and the name that had connected him to Broken Creek, the name no one had said aloud in Nathan's kitchen, quietly ceased to be a factor because Vera Hutchins's husband had a bank account that did business with Nathan Crowley's grain contracts, and Nathan had paid a visit to that bank with no visible anger and a very specific conversation about the terms of their continued relationship. Eleanor found out about the bank visit from Dottie. She sat with it for 2 days. Then she went to the Crowley ranch. Nathan was in the barn. He always was. "The bank," she said. He looked up from what he was doing. He didn't look guilty. He looked like a man who had calculated a thing and done it and was prepared to account for it. "That was mine to handle," Eleanor said. "The Carver claim was yours," he said. "What Hutchins did to put you in that position was a different matter. That was between him and me on separate grounds." "Nathan." "I didn't fight your fight," he said. "I fought my own. There's a difference." She stood there. She thought about the distinction, about whether it was a real one or a convenient one, about the line between protecting someone and undermining their ability to protect themselves. She turned it over, the way she turned everything over, carefully, looking at all the sides. It was a real distinction. She understood that. And she understood something else, that a man who could have ridden to Cheyenne and solved everything in 2 days had instead handed her a letter and waited, and had only acted on the thing that was genuinely his to act on, and had done it on separate grounds. Which was true, because it was his business relationship and his grain contracts and his 15 years of built authority in this county. "All right," she said. He nodded. "But next time you do something on separate grounds," she said, "you tell me." "Fair," he said. The spring ceremony was on a Saturday in the first week of May, when the valley was finally committed to being warm, and the lilac bush by the church door had come in full. Eleanor had made her own dress, deep blue wool fitted properly with good buttons she'd been saving, and she had made it to fit herself exactly as she was, not as someone imagined she ought to be, and she wore it with the same straightness she wore everything. Caleb walked her up the church steps. He had asked gravely and privately if he could do that, and she had said yes without hesitating, because he had earned it in 100 ways over the past year, and he knew it and she knew it, and they didn't need to say that to each other. Sammy was already inside. He had at some point in the previous week decided that his primary job at the wedding was to hold the rings, and he had practiced this responsibility with an intensity that made Eleanor suspect he took it more seriously than most adults took their professional obligations. Nathan was standing at the front of the church when she came in. He was in a good dark coat, clean-shaved, and he was watching the door with the focused attention he brought to everything. And when Eleanor came through, something moved across his face. The same something she'd been learning to read for 4 months. The expression that wasn't quite an expression, but was actually the fullest thing he had. She walked to him. Caleb put her hand in Nathan's and stepped back, and Nathan looked at her hand and then at her face and held both with the same careful steadiness. "You look," he started. "Don't," she said, not unkindly. "Like someone who knows exactly what she's doing," he finished. She looked at him. "Is that what you were going to say?" "Yes." She believed him. She believed him the way she'd believed him at the gate that first morning, immediately and without decoration. Pastor Klein said the words. They were good words, plain and honest, the way good things were. When it came to the part where Nathan was meant to speak, he held her hand, and he said in that low, measured voice that never wasted itself on volume, "I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean. I mean this." Eleanor felt Caleb shift behind her. She felt Sammy's absolute concentrated stillness as he held the rings, a stillness that was the physical expression of maximum responsibility. She felt the particular quality of the room, 30 people, most of the town, some who had come out of genuine warmth, and some who had come because Vera Hutchins wasn't there and they wanted to mark the difference. She said her words. She said them clearly and without hurrying, because she was not a woman who rushed through things that mattered. After outside on the church steps in the May warmth, Dottie hugged her with both arms and held on for a moment longer than necessary, and said in a voice meant only for Eleanor, "He's been alone a long time. So have you. You'll be good for each other." Then she stepped back and composed herself and said briskly that there was food at the ranch and everyone was welcome, and moved off to organize things, which was what Dottie did when she was feeling something she didn't want to display publicly. Sammy appeared at Nathan's side and tugged his coat. Nathan looked down at him. "I held them," Sammy said. "The rings." "You did," Nathan said. "Not a single one dropped." Sammy's face did its enormous thing. "Can I ride a horse today?" "Sammy," Eleanor started. "Yes," Nathan said. Caleb was standing at the edge of the church steps, looking out at the valley with his father's eyes, and Eleanor went to stand beside him. They looked at it together, the spring green of it, the mountains still white at the top, the long road east that she had walked in the cold so many times since January. "You okay?" she asked. He thought about it. He always thought about things before he answered, which was a quality she'd stopped trying to rush. "Dad would have liked him," Caleb said. "He would have taken a while to say so, but he would have." Eleanor looked at her son. She thought about Daniel and his warmth and his easy smile and the way he made every room lighter. She thought about how different Nathan was and how the difference was not a lack, just a different shape of something, a different way of taking up space in the world, quieter and more deliberate and present in its own particular way. "Yes," she said. "He would have." Caleb nodded. He squared his shoulders the way he did when something had been settled. "Okay," he said, and went to find Sammy. Eleanor stood on the church steps alone for a moment. Nathan was nearby, being spoken to by Gerald Marsh and handling it with his customary economy of expression, and he glanced over at her once just briefly, and she gave him a small nod that said, "I'm here," and he gave her one back that said, "I know." She thought about the second notebook, which was on her work table at home, open to the last entry she'd made before this morning. She had sat at the table in the early dark before she'd put on the blue dress, and she had opened it to a fresh page and held her pen for a while, thinking about accounts and what could and couldn't be put in them. Then she had written May 3rd. Balance settled. What comes next doesn't go in a ledger. She had closed the notebook. She had not opened a third one. Some things she had finally accepted were not meant to be accounted for, not because they didn't matter, but because they mattered in a way that lived past numbers, past columns, past the careful architecture of a woman who had survived by knowing exactly where she stood at every moment. She knew where she stood. She just didn't need to write it down anymore. The road east was warm in the May light, and the kitchen garden at her house was already showing its first green, and the work table by the window would be there when she got home. And the second notebook was closed, and Sammy was somewhere nearby, making joyful noise about horses. And Caleb was standing tall in his father's way, and Nathan Crowley was walking toward her now across the church steps with his hat in his hand and the May sun on his face. And that look, patient, steady, entirely present. She had walked into that Wyoming winter with nothing but 2 hungry boys and a smile she'd had to practice. She had come out the other side with work. She'd built herself a name this county was beginning to know. Sons who were learning that asking for help was not the same as surrender, and a man beside her who understood the difference between rescuing someone and standing next to them while they rescued themselves. Eleanor Pierce had not been saved. She had been witnessed. And it turned out that was the thing she had needed all along. Not someone to carry the weight for her, but someone who saw exactly how much she was carrying and said without flinching, "I see it, and I'm not going anywhere." That was not charity. That was not rescue. That was something rarer than either, something the cold Wyoming winter had stripped everything else down, to reveal the plain and unadorned truth that a woman who refuses to stop standing eventually finds someone else who refuses to let her stand alone. And in Broken Creek, Wyoming, in the warm first week of May, 1886, with the lilac by the church door in full bloom, and her son's hand somewhere behind her, and 30 people bearing witness, Eleanor Pierce discovered that surviving was only ever the beginning, and that the life waiting on the other side of the hardest winter was bigger, warmer, and far more hers than anything she had dared to imagine in the dark.